Hello, scholars. I hope you are all having a nice break. Before we meet next, I wanted to give you something to think about, and that's the specific aims page. In a previous class, Teresa had discussed with you a few things about specific aims. So, as a review, she noted that the specific aims are really the main objectives of your argument. They specify how we're going to tackle the problem specifically, outlining the main points of your proposed solution, and they're written in a smart fashion. So they're specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're realistic, and they're time bound. Let's take a look at a few of the examples that she had discussed in class. These are aims looking at adverse childhood experiences. So the first aim, determine the relative contribution of ACEs and neighborhood factors to pre-injury health. And they've outlined some of those health factors there, such as work status, health status. And then they go on to list a couple other specific aims that are separate but related. And as a reminder, typically you have 1 to 3 specific aims, and they can be written as statements, as you see here, or research questions, which we'll see a little bit later. So a specific aims page is different. It's not just the actual aims, which you can see here highlighted on the bottom of this entire specific aims page document, but it is the entire story. It's listed right here as an example. It's a one-page document, and it tells the story of what you're trying to do and concludes with your specific aims or concrete objectives. We will go through all of the components in a bit. But if you just see here, as you scroll down to the bottom of the page, these are where the specific aims are located, usually either directly at the bottom of the document or just about directly at the bottom. And we'll go through that. So what's included in a specific aims page? There's not an exact formula, but these are the basic components. You're going to have some background and significance to your problem, and then you have your problem statement, which is a part of that. You want to communicate a specific purpose about how your project will specifically address the gap and the problem that you've identified. And then you want to list your specific aims and or your research question or questions. Often you'll have a hypothesis linked with these questions. You want to be able to demonstrate impact with a clear impact statement, and of course have relevance. How is this relevant to your audience, to the funding agencies, strategic goals, etc. So let's take a moment to look at our specific aims page that we're using as an example and go through some of these components. Overall, you're trying to convince the reader that this is a significant problem and that you have a great idea and that idea is innovative, and you understand that by understanding this, that scientific knowledge and society and communities will be better because of your solution. So it really all starts with articulating the problem. And your hook is often the problem statement, followed by 4 to 6 sentences summarizing the current knowledge about the topic at hand, and then getting right into the gap that exists. What is not known? What is the current issue at hand? And what is the critical debate or the gap or the need? So what is known, what is unknown, and then moving into why the problem is important. Let's look at this example. Okay, so this is an example that we're going to be using around an intervention and a research project looking at youth violence. So here's how it starts. Gunshot injury is the leading cause of death in 10 to 19-year-old African American males and the second leading cause of adolescent death overall. So there's your hook. So let's go on with some more data. Most adolescents who are killed with guns, 60%, are shot during assaults. And for each gunshot assault that is fatal, 7 adolescents require emergency department treatment for non-fatal assaultive gunshot injury. Again, what's known and more. Additionally, each day, more than 70 adolescents require ED treatment for non-fatal assaultive injuries inflicted with non-gun weapons. Okay, so it's saying assaults in general are important to know about. Nevertheless, and here comes the gap, little is known about the epidemiology of assaultive injury from guns and other weapons among adolescents. Aha, so you got my attention. I see it's a huge problem. I care about the problem, but little is known and we need to know more. So that's the first paragraph of this specific AIMS page. Now, when it goes on, you get into more detail, but you should know from reading the intro what's the problem and what's the gap. Sometimes these problems are more complex and they go into more detail before jumping into the solution. Again, there's not one approach that works for every specific AIMS page. In this example that we're going through, it's going to lead right into the solution. So let's see what happens. Okay, so next paragraph, it goes on. Assaultive injuries appear to be the end result of a causative web of factors that include alcohol, firearms, and dangerous urban environments. Okay, so building up to the solution and the lead sentence, and that's another way of saying assaultive injuries are complex. They have an interplay of factors that stem from the social and built environment. We have already said that we don't really know enough about all of these factors, so then it goes on to say, to assess the assaultive risk posed by these hazards, we propose an innovative application of epidemiologic space-time modeling. Okay, so there is one line of what they are proposing. Right away, they said the problem is that there isn't enough epidemiologic information, and so they're proposing an innovative application to get this information. Now, what the heck is space-time modeling and what example are they going to do? That's what the next 2 to 4 paragraphs do. They walk you through the approach. They say what they're going to do it, and then the next few paragraphs explain how they're going to do it, or your approach. This is typically the longest part of the specific AIMS page. So let's review and think about for a second a few details that would be important to include when you're framing the problem that leads up to the solution. I wanted to have you jot these down and have them for your records, even though we've gone over our problem statement. So a few things that you typically see are, first, the number of people affected. So you're looking at the incidence or the rate of occurrence, the prevalence, so the number of cases at any point in time, and other relevant current statistics on the issue. So you don't want to go back to what we know in 2010. You want to get as current as possible. The next crucial part of the problem is the effects that the problem and the typically health problem are having on individuals or on society as a whole. So just example, the human suffering, it could be decreased work productivity, it could be inequities, healthcare costs, they're endless. But you want to make that real clear. And you want this problem identified as a research priority or a national priority, international priority, if applicable. I mean, you want to know that the world cares about this. And finally, as I've mentioned before, you want to show that the science reflects these gaps in knowledge that are related to the problem. So you don't just want to say, we think there's not enough information on. You want to say with clarity that we know that, or to our knowledge, there is no additional information on this, and you want to do your homework to find that out. And so once you've adequately framed the problem, and as you'll see later, some funders really fall in love with a problem, not just the solution, then you move into your solution. And as we've talked about a little bit, there's a few key factors. So this is the overall purpose. This is where the purpose goes. How your proposal will address the gap identified, what the overall purpose of what you are trying to achieve, and this is important, it is directly linked to your problem. So you don't want to have people guessing or to make that link. There needs to be a clear, logical transition from or progression from the problem to the solution. So then once you've had your overall statement, which we just saw, then you would go into the actual design and the approach and the details, the what, the why, the who, all of the parts of your solution that will be outlined in your upcoming logic model that we will do. And it's here that you'll identify some of the key variables to be studied, and you'll explain your overall approach. As I mentioned, this is often the longest part of the specific aims page, as you can see in this example here. Okay, so then these next three larger paragraphs go into these details. I won't read the whole thing, but you can start by, it builds off of two preliminary research projects they've done. In the preliminary work, they've recruited and consented subjects in the ED. They show that they can do this. We now propose using this innovative technology as a way to understand how daily routines and interactions create windows that place adolescents at risk by gun or non-gun assaults. They keep going by recording and analyzing the routine, so they're talking about what they're doing. Next paragraph, to determine adolescent gunshot injury risk, we propose a population-based case control study. So they're talking about their specific design, adolescents 10 through 19. They go through the details. They say seated side by side. An interviewer in each subject will view the screen of a handheld tablet. I mean, this is where they're going into details about their approach, about what specifically they're going to do and giving the credibility that they are able to do this. Last paragraph, each subject asked to describe his or her activities, including alcohol, firearms, etc., etc. In addition to these narratives, they will use secondary data, blah, blah, blah. The information from the narrative and secondary data will be linked to our maps by location, time of day, and then controlled. And then it continues on to, we primarily aim to answer the following. And this is when you then hit these specific aims. So let's go back and talk about the specific aims a bit more. At this point, I'd probably pause. I'd ask if you had any questions, and I'd make sure you were comfortable with all of the narrative that goes before the specific aims before we start to write those down. At this point, if you've done the homework, you've thought about your specific aims, and you've specifically thought about one of them being a research question. So let's look at some examples of specific aims. First, to reiterate, specific aims are specific as they state, right? They're smart, they're specific, they're measurable, they're attainable and realistic, that they can be done. And typically they're time-bound, or the whole application or proposal is time-bound. So you designate, I'm going to be able to achieve this in 1 year, 2 years, etc. Now, we've seen a few examples of different types of specific aims. This is the first one that we saw related to ACEs, and these are written as aims. So they're statements. You're determining the relative contribution of something. You are assessing the impact. This is the aim of what you're trying to achieve. And, they can be framed as questions or declarative statements, but not both. So let's look at some of them framed as questions, as in these research questions based on the specific aims page we were looking at. So here the researchers want to know, do adolescents who consume alcohol and or carry firearms face a differential risk of being shot with a firearm compared to adolescents who do not consume alcohol or carry firearms? Still, stated as a question, still very specific. It lists some of the variables. Or do adolescents whose daily activities occur in surroundings rich in alcohol and or firearms face a differential risk of being shot with a firearm compared to adolescents who do not spend time in surroundings rich in alcohol and or firearms? So not only are you asking a question, you have a hypothesis built in there, and you have a comparison group, right? So it's compared to adolescents who do not spend time. So this makes for a richer research question. Now, your aims could be geared towards an intervention, which we've heard many of yours are. So intervention studies will tell the effects of the intervention. I believe that an intervention focused on, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy is more effective than, let's say, pamphlets on safe gun storage. And so your aim in this case might be to determine the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy on effective safe storage. And you might hypothesize that cognitive behavioral therapy is more effective than an educational pamphlet. Hypotheses are helpful because they drive your analytical plan. And we'll talk about hypotheses in a bit more detail in a bit. But let's go back to these intervention studies, because I think a lot of you will be focused on that. So the next thing you can think about is testing things at different stages of implementation. So some of you have talked about some early implementation. You have some ideas, you want to feel out what are some of the best strategies. So we can look at different stages of implementation and then different types of aims, from adoption to early implementation, ongoing implementation, sustainability, and scale up to actually de-adoption, stopping something that might not be working. So let's take a few examples. In adoption, you might evaluate the acceptability of a practice in a given setting. So is the program that I'm currently providing acceptable? Or you might you could look at an evidence-based program and evaluate if it's acceptable to the audience that you want to implement the program. Or you look at early implementation, like you're developing or piloting a certain strategy and you want to determine the feasibility. These are all totally in line with AIM. And you can read through some of these other examples here. So this is an exciting part of the video because it comes to the end. Once you have listed your specific aims, you want to go in with the punchline, the bang, the impact, the exclamation, and if you fund this, this is what you're going to get. This is how you will change science, how you will change individuals' lives, communities' lives, populations, and you will convince the funders or any other audience you're trying to convince that they want to invest in you. So here's an example, and you want to be really, really clear. The results of this study have the potential to reduce soaring Medicare and Medicaid costs while decreasing health disparities among minority and low-income older adults. These are impact statements that are pithy, they are specific, and they're clear. You know exactly what the impact is going to be. I would practice with one clear sentence that describes your overall impact. And we'll work through this again when we do our logic models. Now, impact statements don't necessarily have to go at the end. That is a logical flow, but often they come at the beginning of a specific aims page. Often they come right before you list the specific aims and then you conclude with aims. So that's really stylistic and something that you will work out on your own. The main thing is that the impact is included in your specific aims page and you're clear. And I've included a few more examples. It might add critical information to something, such as in this ACEs study. And then you want to also state the relevance. Similar to an impact statement, the relevance is clear. In this case, an example, it meets directly the priorities on violence prevention and child abuse on a significantly at-risk population. And so that is all could be part of the same paragraph where you state the impact and the relevance, and that's your general conclusion. So let us conclude with some common criticisms and things to look out for on your specific aims page. You don't want it to be too ambitious. One study can only do one or two things really well. It's not a lifetime of research, so don't try to do too many things. You want your design and methods to match your aims, so be clear on that. And in general, just a logical flow. You don't want any disconnect. It doesn't matter if the reader knows the field or not. You don't want anyone guessing. You want the variables chosen to measure to be high impact outcomes. This is, and we've talked about a little bit, the so what. So why does this matter? Why is what you're trying to do important, right? So I want to deliver this intervention. So what? So what will happen? And ask yourself, is this a high impact outcome? You want this to be hypothesis driven, not just descriptive. So what does this mean? So think about your language. Avoid saying I am, to determine the best strategies to address youth violence. I mean, you want to be a little bit more, specific and thoughtful about what you're looking for in specific categories or cases, and to help you, you might want to have a hypothesis behind your aim. And so, in other words, you don't want to be merely fishing for things. So how do you start? Well, you write it, you discuss it, you rewrite it again, you read any instructions. Remember, you're writing for an educated audience. You're hoping people with expertise in the field are reviewing it, but sometimes they're not, or they have a tangential experience, and you want to be very clear. You do have citations, just primary citations only. You use clear, simple language, pithy, to the point. Repetition is okay, and consistency of terms is essential. If you're calling something concussion in one sentence and traumatic brain injury in another, that's not going to work. That's going to be confusing. And a few final tips. Use your real estate wisely. This is one page. Everything should matter. If you have a figure in it, that's okay. Figures can be small if they're clear. Fonts can be smaller on the figures. It should be visually appealing. Some people prefer more white space than others, or space in between paragraphs. Cut anything that wanders away from the aims and the main purpose. Have someone else proofread always. I sometimes listen to what I write using a program called Google Translate, and it helps me catch errors. Of course, there's version control. If you're making several versions, make sure you keep track. Read it out loud to yourself. And finally, be succinct. Pithy sentences, with a lot of dependent clauses, they take up space and they're confusing. And the passive voice also takes up space. So you want to be use the active voice as much as possible. So let's do an activity, and this was introduced by a professor here at Penn, Scott Halpern, that we're borrowing this from. And basically, before he sets out to write a grant or an Ames page, there's a few key questions that he simply has a one-sentence answer, or you can just write down a bullet for every key point. So you want to go through and you want to know the answers to each of these key questions, starting with what is the problem you are addressing? Why is the problem significant? What are the key facts that are known about the problem? What are important gaps? What's your long-term goal? What's your narrow objective, overall purpose? What pilot data do you have, if you have any? What are your aims? What is your hypothesis that matches these aims, if applicable? What is the gist of the approach to each of the aims? What is innovative? What is your magic? Why are you well positioned to do this work, showing your likelihood of success? So why don't you, at the least, during this break, go through and answer each of these questions. You can answer them in a sentence form or a bullet, and we will revisit this when you get back. Have a great holiday.